In the deepest chambers of the Ottoman palaces, behind the golden gates of Topkapi and Dolmabahce, there existed a silence heavier than stone. A silence that wrapped around the daughters of empire like an invisible shroud. These were the princesses of the House of Osman, women born into unimaginable privilege, raised amid jeweled fountains, perfumed gardens, and tutors from across the world. Yet for all their power, beauty, and wealth, there was one moment every princess feared more than death: the night she was sent from her father's palace to her husband's bed. The first wedding night, the night of consummation, was the final ritual of obedience, the night that transformed a royal daughter into a possession, and for centuries it was the most secret, the most terrifying event in an Ottoman princess's life. From the moment she opened her eyes to the world, an Ottoman princess was never truly free. She was the blood of the sultan, sacred, precious, untouchable, and for that reason imprisoned. Her childhood was spent within the harem, the royal inner court, a world closed to men and ruled by women and eunuchs. Here every breath of her life was regulated: when to eat, when to walk, when to pray, when to speak. She was taught languages, calligraphy, and poetry, not to enrich her soul but to prepare her for a political destiny she would never choose. The harem was both a paradise and a cage, filled with laughter, music, and silks, yet built on fear, jealousy, and silence. No man other than the sultan and his servants was permitted to see her face. She was the embodiment of royal honor, and her purity was guarded like the empire's most sacred relic. When a princess reached the age of 12 or 13, the whispers began. Her attendants would lower their voices when her name was mentioned in front of visiting pashas. Somewhere beyond the walls, her father or her brother, whichever sultan reigned, would begin to consider which man would be worthy to marry her. But the truth was cruel. Marriage for an Ottoman princess was not about love, companionship, or happiness. It was about politics. It was about control. The sultan did not give his daughters away as gifts of affection. He used them as chains. By marrying a loyal general or a governor to his daughter, the sultan ensured that man's loyalty could never turn against him. After all, who would rebel when his wife and children bore the sultan's blood? So when the decision was made, it was announced not to her but to the court. A royal decree was written. Her husband was named, her dowry was measured, and preparations began. The princess's opinion was never asked. She was simply told. She might never have seen the man, never even heard his voice. Often she was a teenager, while her husband was a battle-worn pasha in his 40s or 50s. The wedding ceremony was dazzling. The empire's wealth on full display. Silk tents were raised across the city, cannons fired in celebration, fountains flowed with sherbet, and musicians played for days. From the outside, it looked like the pinnacle of joy, a royal union, a divine blessing. But behind the curtains, the bride trembled. She was being sent away from everything she had ever known, to live with a stranger whose power over her was absolute. When the celebrations ended, the fear began. The princess was bathed and perfumed by her attendants, her skin dusted with gold powder, her lips tinted with rose oil. Her hair was braided with pearls, and a veil of white silk was placed over her head. But beneath the layers of beauty, her heart was breaking. She knew what came next. That night would be the proof of her obedience, her loyalty, and her purity. For the first time, she would be alone with a man she had never spoken to, a man who was legally her husband but emotionally a stranger. And everyone in the palace knew that the wedding was not truly valid until the marriage was consummated. The act itself was turned into a ritual of proof. The royal chamber would be prepared with care. Candles were lit, incense filled the air, and silk sheets were spread on the bed. White sheets, deliberately white, so that what happened that night could be proven. Outside the door, attendants waited in silence. Some would later carry out the sheets as evidence to be sent back to the palace, proof that the princess was a virgin, and that the marriage had been fulfilled. This practice, ancient and cruel, reduced the most intimate act of a human life into a political contract written in blood. The princess knew that if there was no proof, shame would fall not only on her, but on her entire family. She was terrified not only of pain, but of failure. A failure that could destroy her father's honor and her husband's status. The men they married were not gentle. They were warriors, administrators, men who commanded armies and provinces, men used to obedience and silence. To them, the marriage was an order from the sultan, a duty, a test, and a privilege wrapped in danger. Because to displease the sultan's daughter, to hurt her, or to be accused of disrespecting her, was a crime that could end in execution. There are accounts of husbands who, out of fear, could not even look at their wives that night. Others, desperate to prove themselves, acted with brutality. The princess was caught between two terrors: the wrath of the empire if she resisted, and the violence of her husband if she submitted. Within the harem, the servants and other women whispered stories. Some said that a few princesses fainted before entering the chamber, their bodies refusing to obey their fear. Others refused outright, locking themselves in their rooms until they were forced out by guards. One legend tells of a young princess, barely 14, who was married to a powerful governor. On her first night, she screamed so loudly that the guards outside the chamber wept. By morning, her voice was gone. She never spoke again. Her husband was transferred to another province, and she was sent back to the capital, where she lived in silence until her death. Another story speaks of a princess who tried to flee before her wedding night, dressing as a servant to escape through the palace gardens. She was caught, and the story of her punishment was erased from all official records. This fear did not come from ignorance alone. It came from the culture that raised them, a world where a woman's body was not her own. Even though these princesses were surrounded by luxury, they were forbidden the simplest freedom. They could not walk outside unaccompanied. They could not speak to men who were not family. They could not look at the stars from the roof without permission. They were told from birth that they were fragile, pure, sacred, but those very words became their prison. When the time came to marry, all the innocence that had been forced upon them became the weapon used against them. They were told to be brave, to be silent, to submit, and what happened after that night was rarely better. Once the marriage was consummated, the princess's life entered a new kind of captivity. Her husband, now tied to the royal family, was sent away to govern distant provinces: Aleppo, Baghdad, Damascus, or Egypt. The princess followed, leaving behind the world she knew. Her palace was large, her servants many, but her loneliness was complete. She lived far from her family, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. Her letters were censored, her visits restricted. She was the sultan's daughter, but she had no power over her own life. Every action, every decision was watched and reported back to Istanbul. The first wedding night was not just the loss of innocence, it was the beginning of lifelong isolation. Many princesses suffered quietly. Some became mothers, raising their children under the shadow of court politics. Others turned bitter, using their wealth to manipulate or control their husbands. A few, like Mihrimah Sultan, the daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, learned to turn fear into influence. Mihrimah's marriage, too, was arranged, but over time she wielded her position to become one of the most powerful women of the Ottoman court. Yet even she, in her letters, confessed that the night of her marriage had left scars she could never forget. "I entered that room as a child," she wrote, "and left it as a shadow." Through the centuries, the cycle repeated. Princess after princess endured the same ritual and the same silence, the same fear. Some learned to hide their dread behind painted smiles and lowered eyes. Others rebelled quietly, refusing intimacy, turning their marriages into formal alliances rather than personal ones. But all of them carried the same secret terror: the memory of that night when the empire demanded proof of their obedience. In the grand halls of history, the Ottomans are remembered for their conquests, their art, their architecture, their glory. Yet behind that empire's triumphs stood the silent suffering of women whose names we barely know. The princesses who were raised to embody power but denied the right to control their own lives. They were symbols of dynastic strength, yet personally powerless. Their beauty was used to bind men to the throne. Their purity was turned into a political weapon. For them, the first wedding night was not a beginning. It was an ending. The end of freedom, of innocence, of self. And so when the palace corridors grew quiet and the sound of drums from the wedding feast faded into the night, a single candle burned in a room veiled with gold. A young girl sat trembling on a bed of silk, her hands cold, her heart breaking. Outside, the empire slept, unaware of the fear that lived within its own walls. She was a princess, born in luxury, raised in reverence, but about to step into a world where even her body was no longer hers. The door would open, the candles would flicker, and she would face the moment that every Ottoman princess dreaded. That was why Ottoman princesses were afraid of their first wedding night, not because of the man, or the act, or the darkness of the chamber, but because in that single night, they were stripped of everything the world had told them they were. Their purity became their prison. Their obedience became their punishment, and the echoes of their silence still linger in the marble halls of the palaces where they once lived. The ghosts of royal daughters who learned, too young, that to be born in a golden cage is not a blessing, but a curse.